In the summer of 1877, a farmer in Bledsoe County, Tennessee, was patching a rotted wall in his cabin when his fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. A hole, small, perfectly round, bored clean through the outer plank from the wood-lined side. He put his eye to it and realized someone standing in the trees behind his house could see directly into his daughter's bedroom. He walked to his neighbor's house, then the next one, then the next. By the end of the week, 17 homes in the valley had been checked. Every single one had at least one hole. Some had 4. One had 11. They all faced the same ridge. And the family that lived on that ridge had been there for 6 years, keeping to themselves, refusing every invitation, marrying only each other. However, when the sheriff finally rode up to the Halbrook property to ask a few questions, what he found in that house was so disturbing that the official report was sealed for 42 years, and the deputy who accompanied him quit the force the following morning and never spoke of it again. This is the story of the Halbrooks, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand why some historians believe they weren't the only family doing this, and why the pattern you're about to see may point to something much older and much more organized than a single deranged bloodline in the Tennessee hills. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel. We cover the buried, the sealed, the deliberately forgotten, the stories that got scrubbed from the textbooks because they didn't fit the version of history we were handed. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe. Then let's get into it. The Halbrook family arrived in the Secrecy Valley sometime in the autumn of 1871. Nobody in the surrounding communities remembers seeing them come in. There's no wagon trail record, no store account opened, no church roll they signed. They simply appeared on a piece of land that had been abandoned for 9 years, and they started building. The patriarch was a man named Elias Halbrook. He was tall, thin, and had the kind of face that made grown men look at the ground when he spoke to them. His wife was called Mercy, though nobody in the valley was ever sure if that was her real name or something Elias had decided she would be called. They had, at the time of their arrival, 4 children. By 1877, they had 11. The math on that never quite worked out. The Halbrooks did not attend church. They did not send children to the schoolhouse. They did not trade at the general store in Pikeville. When they needed something, one of the older boys would ride down at night, leave a written list and a payment in a jar behind the smokehouse, and be gone before sunrise. The storekeeper, a man named Josiah Carter, said in a letter written years later that he only ever saw one of them face to face, and that the boy's eyes made him feel like he was being measured for something. The property itself sat on the highest ridge in that stretch of the valley. From their front porch, you could see 14 homesteads. From the roof of the barn, you could see 22. And from a small platform they had built into the tallest pine on the property, you could see, on a clear day, all the way to the outskirts of Dunlap. At the time, nobody thought much of it. A family that kept to themselves. A ridge with a good view. That was mountain living. But what the valley didn't know was that the Halbrooks had been watching them, cataloguing them, studying them, for 6 years. The man who found the first hole was named Thomas Ferrin. He was 34 years old, a widower, and he lived with his 15-year-old daughter Eliza in a 2-room cabin along the creek. On the afternoon of the 11th of June, 1877, he was replacing a section of siding that had rotted through when he noticed something odd about the plank he was pulling off. There was a hole in it, about the size of a large marble, and it had been drilled, not worn. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. He turned the plank over and saw that on the outside face someone had carved a small notch above the hole, almost like a sight line, almost like a marker. He stepped away from the wall and walked around to the back of his house. The hole was positioned exactly at eye level for a grown man, and when he crouched and looked through it from the outside, he was looking directly at the corner of the room where his daughter kept her bed. Thomas Ferrin did not sleep that night. He sat on the porch with a shotgun across his knees, and at first light he rode to his nearest neighbor, a family called the Whitesides. He asked them to check their walls. They found 2 holes, both facing the ridge, both at eye level, both with the same small carved notch above them, like a signature. By the end of the week, 17 households had been searched. Every home in the valley that faced the Halbrook ridge had holes bored into it. And when the men of the valley started comparing what could be seen through each hole, a pattern emerged that made every one of them sick. The holes weren't random, they were targeted. Each one gave a clear view of a specific room, a specific bed, a specific person. In every household, the hole was positioned to watch the youngest daughter of the family. Now, here's where it gets stranger, and this is the part that historians who have looked at the case have never been able to explain. The holes were not all drilled at the same time. When the men of the valley examined the planks carefully, they found that some of the wood around the holes was aged and weathered, while other holes had been made much more recently. The oldest ones appeared to date back to 1872 or 1873, only a year or two after the Halbrooks arrived. The newest ones had been made within the last 6 months, which meant this had been going on for 5 years, possibly 6, and nobody had noticed. They also discovered that the holes had been maintained. When siding was replaced by a homeowner, a new hole would appear in the new plank within a few weeks. When a family built an addition to their home, holes would appear in the new walls. When the Weatherford family had painted their entire cabin the previous summer, the paint on the hole edges was smooth and unbroken, meaning the holes had been drilled and then painted over, and then reopened from the outside after the paint dried. Someone had been coming down from that ridge, at night, for years, and modifying the homes of every family in the valley, without being seen, without being heard, without leaving a single footprint that anyone had ever noticed, and they had been watching. For 6 years they had been watching. The sheriff of Bledsoe County at the time was a man named Marcus Handley. He was 41, a Union veteran, and by every account not a man who scared easily. When Thomas Ferrin and 8 other heads of household rode into Pikeville on the 19th of June, 1877, and laid out what they had found, Handley listened to the entire account without interrupting. Then he stood up, put on his hat, and told his deputy to saddle 2 horses. The deputy was a young man named Silas Ford, 23 years old. He had been on the job for less than a year. According to the recollections of his sister, published in a small Tennessee newspaper in 1919, Silas kissed his mother goodbye that morning like a man who wasn't sure he was coming back. The 2 lawmen rode up the ridge road to the Halbrook property around 3 in the afternoon. They arrived at the front porch. The house was silent. Handley called out. There was no answer. He called out again. Still nothing. And then, according to the deputy's later statement, they heard a sound coming from inside the house. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound, Silas Ford said, of many people breathing at the same time, very quietly, from behind the door. Handley drew his sidearm. He pushed the door open, and what he saw in that front room was something he would refuse to describe in writing for the rest of his life. Before we move on to what Sheriff Handley found inside that house, stop for a second. What you just heard about the ridge, the 6 years of watching, and the maintained holes in every wall in the valley is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original 1877 field report, the sheriff's own words, the deputy's statement. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. All right, here is what we know about what Sheriff Handley found inside the Halbrook home on the afternoon of the 19th of June, 1877, based on the deputy's later statement, a letter Handley wrote to his brother in 1883, and the sealed county report that was finally released in 1919. The front room of the house was empty of furniture. There were no chairs, no table, no rug. The floor was made of hard-packed earth, and along every wall, from floor to ceiling, were shelves, wooden shelves, hundreds of them, and on those shelves were what the report described as objects of a personal nature taken from the homes of neighbours. Handkerchiefs, combs, small pieces of jewellery, locks of hair tied with ribbon, a child's shoe, a wedding photograph in a broken frame, a doll, a page torn from a family Bible. Every shelf was labelled with a name and a date, and every name was the name of a family in the valley below. They had been going into the homes, not just watching, going in. For 6 years, members of the Halbrook family had been entering the homes of every family in that valley at night while the families slept, and they had been taking things, small things, things nobody would miss, things that would not be reported stolen, and they had been keeping them on shelves arranged by household like a collection. The sound of breathing that Handley and Ford had heard from the porch was coming from the back of the house. Handley moved through the front room, weapon raised, and pushed open the door to the second room. And what he saw there was, according to the report, the reason the file was sealed. The 11 Halbrook children were seated on the floor of the back room, in a circle, facing outward. Their eyes were open, and they were staring at the walls. Elias and Mercy Halbrook were not present. They were, in fact, never found. The children did not respond when Handley spoke to them. They did not respond when he touched them. They continued to stare at the walls, breathing in unison, until Handley and Ford physically carried them out of the house one by one. And when Handley examined the walls of that back room, he understood what the children had been looking at, because every wall in that back room had holes in it too, holes bored through the planks, holes that faced the valley below, holes positioned at the exact height of a seated child. The Halbrook children had been watching the valley every night, in shifts, since they were old enough to sit up. The 11 Halbrook children were taken into Pikeville and held at a boarding house owned by the Methodist congregation. A doctor was brought in from Chattanooga. 2 ministers attempted to speak with them, and for the first 4 days, none of them said a word. On the 5th day, the oldest of the children, a girl who was believed to be around 14 years old, spoke for the first time. She said one sentence, and according to the deputy, who was present in the room, she said it in a voice that did not sound like a child's voice at all. She said, quote, "You were not supposed to find us yet." End quote. She would not elaborate. When asked who us was, she stared at the wall. When asked what she meant by yet, she stared at the wall. When asked where her parents had gone, she smiled. It was the only time any of the 11 children smiled during the entire time they were in custody. Over the following weeks, small fragments came out of the younger children. A 5-year-old boy told a minister that his father had taught him to sit still and see. A 7-year-old girl said that they were counting the sleeping ones. A 9-year-old boy, when asked why they had taken items from the homes in the valley, said that the items were for the ones who would come after. Nobody in Pikeville knew what any of this meant. The children were eventually placed with families across 3 different counties. Records of what happened to them after that are incomplete. 2 of the older ones ran away within a year. One of the younger girls was reported to have started drilling small holes in the walls of her foster home and was moved to an asylum in Nashville. The rest, as far as anyone can tell, grew up and disappeared into the ordinary population of eastern Tennessee. Elias and Mercy Halbrook were never located. A search of the property in July of 1877 found a trapdoor in the barn that led to a tunnel. The tunnel extended for nearly 300 yards through the ridge and emerged in a hollow on the other side. From that hollow, a horse trail led north into the mountains and disappeared. Now here is where the story stops being about one family and starts being about something much larger. In 1881, 4 years after the events in the Sequatchie Valley, a similar case emerged in Rowan County, Kentucky. A family named Pettit was found to have drilled watching holes into the homes of every household in a 2-mile radius of their property. They had been doing it, according to the local investigation, for at least 8 years. In 1889, in Rockingham County, Virginia, a family called the Marshalls were driven out of their community after neighbors discovered that their eldest son had been entering homes at night and taking small personal items. The pattern of what he took and how he arranged it matched the Halbrook collection almost exactly. In 1896, in Union County, Georgia, a family whose name was never officially recorded was found to have been watching their neighbors from a platform built into a tree on a ridge above the town. They had been there for 11 years. And in 1902, a researcher named Elias Whitcomb published a small, self-printed pamphlet in Knoxville that documented 17 separate cases across the Appalachian region between 1,868 and 1,901. Every case involved a family that arrived quietly, kept to themselves, refused contact with the community, and was eventually discovered to have been watching, and in many cases entering, the homes of everyone around them. Whitcomb argued that these families were not isolated. He believed they were connected. He believed they were following an older instruction, passed down through generations, from a period he referred to only as the earlier settlement. He believed that whatever these families were doing, it had a purpose that predated the arrival of European settlers in the region. Whitcomb's pamphlet was suppressed within 6 months of publication. The printer was pressured to destroy the plates. Every known copy was collected and burned, except for one, which surfaced in a private library in Asheville in 1958. It is that surviving copy that most modern researchers of the Halbrook case have drawn from. So what were they doing? What was the point of 6 years of watching, 6 years of collecting, 6 years of teaching their children to sit in a circle and stare through holes in the wall at families they had never met? The most common explanation, offered by historians who have looked at the case, is mental illness. A family patriarch with a severe delusion, a wife who submitted to it, children who knew no other way of living. It's the easiest answer. It fits inside a framework we can understand. But it doesn't explain the pattern. It doesn't explain why the same behavior appeared in 17 different families, in different states, over more than 3 decades. It doesn't explain why they all took the same kinds of items and arranged them the same way. It doesn't explain why the Halbrook children, when asked what they were doing, said they were counting the sleeping ones and preparing something for the ones who would come after. And it doesn't explain the tunnels. Because when the Pettit property in Kentucky was searched in 1881, investigators found a tunnel. When the Marshall property in Virginia was searched in 1889, they found a tunnel. Every single one of the 17 properties documented by Whitcomb had a tunnel. All of them led away from the house, through a ridge or a hill, and emerged in a hollow on the other side. All of them ended at a horse trail leading north, into the mountains. North to where, nobody has ever been able to determine. What was waiting at the end of that trail, whether it was a person, a settlement, or something the families in these hills had names for but would not say out loud, remains one of the oldest unanswered questions in Appalachian history. The Halbrook file was sealed in 1877 and remained sealed until 1919. Sheriff Marcus Handley died in 1904 without ever discussing the case publicly. Deputy Silas Ford quit the force the morning after the raid, moved to Missouri, and refused to speak about what he had seen for the rest of his life. When he was interviewed by a journalist in 1918, a year before his death, he was asked one final time what he had seen inside that house. His answer was recorded, and I want you to hear it exactly as he gave it. He said, quote, "It wasn't what I saw, it was what I understood while I was standing there, that we had all been watched for a very long time, that the watching had a reason, and that whoever the Halbrooks were answering to, they are still out there, and they are still watching, and they are still counting." End quote. Silas Ford died in his sleep 6 weeks after giving that statement. The journalist who interviewed him attempted to publish it in a Missouri newspaper. The article was killed by the editor. The notes were never recovered. The Sequatchie Valley today is a quiet place. The Halbrook Ridge is still there, though the house burned down in 1889, and nothing has been built on the property since. The tunnel in the barn was filled in with concrete by the county in 1923. The story is not in any of the local history books. It is not on any of the plaques or the walking tours. But if you drive through that valley on a summer evening, and you stand on the porch of one of the older cabins, and you look up at the ridge, you can still see the pines. And you can still, if you know what you're looking for, see the faint outline of the platform they built into the tallest pine. Whatever the Halbrooks were doing, they were not alone. Whatever they were teaching their children, other families were teaching too. And whatever they were counting, and preparing for, and waiting on, has never been explained. The file is public now. The pamphlet exists. The pattern is there for anyone who wants to look at it. What you do with it is up to you. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the buried ones, the sealed ones, the ones that don't fit the version of history we were handed, the next video is already on screen. Click it now.